A rancher lived alone for years, until 6 beautiful girls knelt at his ranch. The sun hung low over the Montana horizon, painting the endless prairie in shades of amber and gold as dust devils danced across the dried earth. Thomas Whitfield stood on his porch, a weathered man of 63, his calloused hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. For 17 years, he had worked this land alone, ever since the accident that took his wife and daughter, ever since the day he decided the world was better experienced at a distance. The ranch stretched across 800 acres of rolling hills and sparse grassland, home to 200 head of cattle, 3 horses, and a solitude so complete it had become his only companion. Neighbors rarely visited anymore, tired of his gruff responses and closed-off demeanor, tired of trying to breach walls he'd spent nearly 2 decades building brick by brick. The town of Copper Ridge lay 15 miles east, a place Thomas visited only when supplies ran low, speaking to no one beyond what was absolutely necessary. His routine had become sacred in its simplicity. Wake at dawn, tend the animals, mend fences, eat alone, sleep alone, repeat until the sun rose again. But on this particular Tuesday in late September, the sound of an engine struggling up his long dirt driveway shattered the silence he'd grown so accustomed to. Thomas squinted against the setting sun, watching as a battered blue van lurched and sputtered, finally dying about 50 yards from his house. The driver's door opened and a young woman stepped out, maybe 25 years old, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face etched with exhaustion and something that looked like desperation. Then 5 more doors opened, and Thomas felt his chest tighten as 5 more young women emerged, each one looking road-weary and uncertain. The first woman approached slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of peace, her voice carrying across the dusty yard with a tremor that spoke of barely contained emotion. "Sir, I'm so sorry to bother you, but our van broke down and we've been driving for hours without seeing another house. We wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate." Thomas stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to send them away, to protect the walls he'd built so carefully, but something in her eyes stopped him cold. "There's a mechanic in Copper Ridge 15 miles that way. You can call for a tow," he said, his voice rough from disuse, pointing east with a weathered hand. "We tried. Our phones have no signal out here, and we don't have money for a tow truck anyway," she replied, her voice breaking slightly on the last words. The other 5 women had gathered behind her now, and Thomas noticed things he'd tried not to see, the way their clothes hung loose on too thin frames, the shadows under their eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the fear that radiated from them like heat from sun-baked stone. "What are 6 young women doing driving through the middle of nowhere in a van that barely runs?" Thomas asked, his tone harsher than intended, his defense mechanisms kicking in automatically. The first woman, who introduced herself as Elena, took a deep breath before speaking, her words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "We escaped from a work camp in Nevada 3 days ago. We were promised jobs at a resort, but when we arrived, they took our documents, locked us in trailers, forced us to work 20-hour days with no pay." Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd worn for so long it had become part of his skin. "The guards got careless during a shift change and we ran. We stole this van, and we've been driving ever since, trying to get to the Canadian border where Elena has family." The sun had nearly set now, and in the fading light Thomas could see the bruises on their arms, the cuts on their hands, the unmistakable marks of people who'd been treated as property rather than human beings. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, but his voice had lost its edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like concern. "You shouldn't," Elena said simply, her honesty cutting through his skepticism like a knife through butter. "But we have nowhere else to go, and if you turn us away, we'll have to walk to the next house, which your mailbox says is 12 miles south, and I don't think we'll make it." For a long moment, Thomas stood there wrestling with himself. 17 years of isolation, battling against something older and deeper, something his late wife Sarah would have called basic human decency. "There's a bunkhouse out back. Hasn't been used in years, but it has beds and a bathroom. You can stay tonight and I'll look at your van in the morning." The relief that washed over their faces was so profound that Thomas had to look away, uncomfortable with the weight of their gratitude. He showed them to the bunkhouse, a simple structure with 6 cots, a wood stove, and running water that ran brown for the first minute before clearing. "There's canned food in the kitchen of the main house. I'll bring some over, and blankets are in that chest," he said, gesturing to an old cedar box in the corner. Elena grabbed his arm gently as he turned to leave, her touch light, but stopping him as surely as an anchor stops a ship. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield. You don't know what this means to us. You don't know what we've been through." "It's just one night," Thomas said gruffly, pulling away from her touch like it burned, uncomfortable with any form of physical contact after so many years alone. But one night became 2, as Thomas discovered the van needed a new alternator, a part he'd have to order from Billings, which would take 3 to 4 days to arrive. During those days, something remarkable happened, something Thomas hadn't planned for and couldn't control no matter how hard he tried to maintain his distance. The women, despite their trauma and exhaustion, began to help around the ranch without being asked, tending to tasks he'd let slide for months. Maria, the youngest at 19, had grown up on a farm in Guatemala and knew her way around livestock, helping him treat a calf with an infected hoof. Sophia and Grace, sisters from the Philippines, began repairing the broken fence in the east pasture, their hands working in perfect synchronization born of years together. Yuki from Japan, who had studied veterinary medicine before being lured by false promises of a scholarship in America, examined his oldest horse and mixed herbs for the animal's arthritis. Chen from China, who barely spoke English but communicated through actions, began organizing his chaotic tool shed with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. And Elena, who Thomas learned had been a social worker in Honduras before seeking a better life, quietly began cooking meals that appeared on his porch at regular intervals. On the 4th evening, Thomas found all 6 of them kneeling in his barn, their heads bowed not in prayer but in exhaustion after spending the entire day mucking out stalls he'd been neglecting. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, angry at them for reasons he couldn't quite name, angry at himself for caring, angry at the world for putting them in this situation. Elena looked up at him with eyes that held no judgment, only a quiet understanding that somehow made everything worse. "You gave us shelter when you didn't have to. You're helping us escape when you could have called the authorities. This is the only way we know how to say thank you." "I don't want your thanks. I don't want anything from you. The part will be here tomorrow and you can leave," Thomas said, his voice rising with each word, desperate to restore the walls they'd somehow managed to breach. But that night, as Thomas lay awake in his empty house, he heard voices drifting from the bunkhouse, heard them singing softly in 6 different languages, creating a harmony that spoke of hope despite everything they'd endured. He remembered Sarah singing to their daughter Emma, remembered the sound of life and laughter that had once filled this ranch before silence became his only companion. Morning came with unexpected visitors, 2 black SUVs rolling up his driveway with the kind of purpose that made Thomas's blood run cold. 4 men in suits emerged, their faces hard and businesslike, their eyes scanning the property with the practiced gaze of people who found human beings for a living. "We're looking for 6 women who stole property from our employer. We have reason to believe they might have come through this area," the lead man said, flashing a badge that looked official but felt wrong. Thomas stood on his porch, his old shotgun within easy reach inside the door, his mind racing through options and consequences. "Haven't seen anyone, just me and my cattle out here. You're welcome to look around, but you won't find anything." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. A predator's smile that made Thomas's skin crawl with recognition and disgust. "That van down by your shed, the blue one with Nevada plates, you buy that recently?" Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs but kept his face neutral, channeling every poker game he'd ever played, every negotiation he'd ever navigated. "Found it abandoned on my property 2 days ago. Figured some kids went joyriding and ditched it, haven't gotten around to calling it in." The men spread out across his property, and Thomas watched them move toward the bunkhouse, watched them get closer to the 6 women who'd somehow worked their way past his defenses. Then, from behind the barn, his dog started barking, the old cattle dog he'd nearly forgotten about, and Thomas saw his opportunity. "That'll be coyotes near the herd. Happens this time of year. You gentlemen should probably wait by your vehicles unless you want to spook 800 pounds of angry beef. He strode toward the barn with purpose, firing his shotgun twice in the air, the sound echoing across the prairie like thunder, creating just enough chaos and distraction. By the time the men regrouped, satisfied that their search had yielded nothing, Thomas had bought precious time, though he knew it wouldn't last. After they left, 6 women emerged from the root cellar beneath the main house, a hiding place Thomas had shown them that morning, as if some part of him had known this moment was coming. They'll be back with more men and probably actual authorities. You need to leave now tonight. Take my truck and go, Thomas said, his voice urgent but steady. They'll trace your truck back to you. They'll know you helped us. You'll lose everything, Elena protested, tears streaming down her face for the first time since she'd arrived. I've already lost everything that mattered 17 years ago when my family died. All this, he gestured at the ranch around them, is just property, just things. Your people with lives ahead of you. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Thomas Whitfield felt something crack open inside him, felt the ice around his heart begin to thaw in a way that was both painful and liberating. He gave them his truck, $3,000 he had in a safe, and detailed directions to a border crossing where a friend from his military days owed him a favor. As they prepared to leave, all 6 women knelt before him one final time, not in servitude or desperation, but in genuine gratitude and respect. Elena spoke for them all, her voice strong despite her tears, her words carrying the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they hoped to become. You gave us back something those men tried to take away. You treated us like human beings when the world wanted to treat us like property. We'll never forget you. Thomas helped them into his truck, watched the taillights disappear down his driveway, and for the first time in 17 years he didn't feel alone in his solitude. He felt connected to something larger than himself, connected to the belief that sometimes strangers become family, that sometimes helping others helps us heal ourselves. The authorities came 3 days later asking questions, and Thomas told them the truth about the abandoned van, leaving out only the parts that mattered most. They confiscated his truck, investigated his property, but found nothing to connect him to 6 missing women who were already safe across the Canadian border. 6 months later, a letter arrived with no return address, just 6 signatures, and a photograph of 6 women standing together, smiling freely for perhaps the first time in years. Thomas Whitfield pinned that photograph above his kitchen sink, a reminder that sometimes our greatest act of courage is simply opening our door to someone in need. The ranch still stretched across 800 acres. The cattle still needed tending, the fences still needed mending, but the silence no longer felt quite so heavy. And on quiet evenings, when the sun painted the prairie in shades of amber and gold, Thomas sometimes heard echoes of 6 voices singing in 6 languages, a harmony of hope that had somehow saved them all. Retry.